China's new ambassador in Manila has gone on the offensive, publicly threatening Philippine officials by name, demanding China's critics pay the price for standing up and speaking out. Today's guest, Coast Guard Commodore Tarriela, is at the center of this storm. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing even summoned the Philippine ambassador about him, labeling him a provocateur. But he says he's not backing down. What explains this sudden shift, this highly personalized onslaught? And how should a smaller country respond to this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy? Let's dive in to find out why we should care about the Chinese embassy's war of words with Philippine officials. And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. Of course, we will tell you more about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell. I'm the former military officer over here in California. And in Arizona is the former diplomat, Jim Caruso. How are you, Jim?
It's a dark and stormy night, Ray.
Well, it is getting a little late on the West Coast here, but it's early in the morning in the Philippines, which is what we're talking about today. And that's because China's new ambassador to the Philippines has been taking the gloves off. In fact, the embassy recently launched an aggressive war of words against its critics, beginning with today's guest, accusing him of, quote, attacking and smearing Chinese leaders and committing, quote, a serious violation of China's political dignity and a blatant political provocation. It has since also gone after other critics, including several Philippine legislators. The Philippine government, says the Chinese embassy has crossed the line into domestic interference, and our guest says he won't be silenced. Our guest is return offender Commodore Tarriela of the Philippine Coast Guard, spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea. He, of course, was the star of one of our earliest episodes, episode 5, in which we discussed China's harassment of Philippine ships. Jay, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Ray. James, good morning in this part of the world. It's an honor for me to join your podcast once again.
Great. Well, I do need to do a little bit of full disclosure because I, in my capacity as executive director of the U.S.-based Sea Light Foundation, which is a maritime transparency nonprofit organization, have also been a target of several attacks by the Chinese embassy in the same time frame. I should further note that as Jay and I are both maritime transparency advocates, we have many critics in common, some of whom have publicly linked us together in some very colorful and conspiratorial ways. But we'll get to that later on. So, Tarriela, why should our audience care about the Chinese embassy's war of words with Philippine officials?
Well, everybody should care about the current behavior of the Chinese embassy right now. Let me reiterate, this is not the behavior of the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, but this is the behavior of the Chinese embassy that we host in our own soil and, criticizing our public officials and our lawmakers. Try to imagine if this kind of behavior will also be uh, done by the Chinese embassy in U.S., for example, or any other parts of the Indo-Pacific. This will be a blatant ridicule of your own government. So we need to come up with, we need to expose this so that the Chinese would eventually stop doing this, and they would realize that this is not in accordance with the Vienna Convention for Diplomatic Relations. That as a diplomatic mission, they have to abide with a set of norms, and they should, really practice good diplomacy as a visitor in our own country.
So, Jay, it seems that the Philippines is being singled out for special treatment. Do you think that's true? And if so, why?
Well, I think we are receiving so much extra special treatment from the Chinese government. It's because the Philippines is the only country in Southeast Asia who has been doing transparency efforts and in telling the world that China bullies ordinary Filipino fishermen, harasses smaller Coast Guard vessels from the Philippines, and most importantly, they are also violating the international law and disrespecting the UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award.
So, Jay, let's go back to sort of the beginning of this current kerfuffle, this current dust up between the Chinese embassy and Philippine government officials. So, of course, you just got a new ambassador. They sort of brought in his own regime, his own way of doing things. And at the same time, you were out on a bit of a you've been out recently on a bit of a tour of, say, college campuses and other places where you've been talking to students about the West Philippine Sea and why it's important to the Philippines and those kinds of things. And the Chinese embassy fixated on a picture of you in front of some AI generated pictures of Xi Jinping doing various things regarding or related to the West Philippine Sea. And they called that essentially the insult to Xi Jinping himself and really demanded action against you, including, believe, calling the Philippine ambassador in for consultations and demanding essentially that you, quote, pay the price.
Yep. These are the things that they did just because of one slide that I have like satirical images of President Xi Jinping. And the title of this slide is Why China Remains to be Bullied. And, those three images that I presented as is not something that I personally created, and it's not intended to mock the Chinese government. It's satirical images to explain why China, despite of the transparency efforts of the Philippine government for almost 3 years now, remains to be bullied, why China remains to violate international law and fail to respect our own rights within the West Philippine Sea.
So are you getting support from the government and from legislators, Jay?
Well, I think for the past days, the support that I got from the national government on the executive side, it has been tremendous. The Department of Foreign Affairs issued two statements already. The Department of National Defense and the National Security Council, and even to the legislative branch of our government, there were senators, Senator Risa Ontiveros, Senator Kiko Pangilinan, Senator Erwin Tulpo, and even for the lower house, we also have Congresswoman De Lima and Congressman Shil Jokno. So for me, I have the backing of the full nation. We are they are supportive of what we do, and for them, transparency efforts in the West Philippine Sea is a very effective tool, not just in countering Chinese aggression, but definitely to make the Filipino people realize the importance of standing up against bullying, and also to get the international community support as well.
So, Jay, this is not new, right? You've been out there for 3 years, on this particular issue, and of course, you've had many, uh, yeah, as you call them, trolls or critics, and people who call you names and all the other kinds of things. But this kind of direct assault from the embassy feels very different. Why do you think this is happening now?
Well, before, I only thought that this is something that is being done by the new ambassador, who happens to be the former deputy chief of mission in the United States, the Chinese embassy in US. So I thought this is probably the strategy of the new ambassador, so that he'll get noticed by the Philippines, and at the same time by the mainland Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But since it reached to the level of Beijing, um, knowing the fact that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs even issued a threatening statement against me, summoning our own Philippine ambassador in Beijing, and demanding that I should the damages that I have done towards the Chinese image should be corrected immediately. I realized that this strategy did not emanate from the Chinese embassy here in the Philippines. It is actually it can be traced from the center of gravity in Beijing, and for me, their main objective really is to put a pressure on the Philippine government to completely stop entirely the transparency efforts that we have been doing for more than almost 3 years already.
So, Jay, the Philippines is the chair of ASEAN for this year, and I'm wondering if it's possible that the ramp up in rhetoric and attacks on your efforts is because the Philippines is the leader in ASEAN of fighting for transparency. Is that a possibility? Have you heard anything like that?
Well, Jim, I think that's a very good reason as well. For me personally, um, I came up with possible three explanation why China really wanted to end transparency efforts of the Philippine government. I agree with you. That's actually the first reason that I have as as a main reason why Chinese government want to silent transparency. It's because try to imagine if all the ASEAN meeting will be held here in Manila, and every month we're going to publicize all the incidents that are happening. It will make the attendees from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or any part of the Southeast Asian government to visit here, learning about the incidents on a weekly or monthly or even daily basis, because that's
Mm,
what we have been doing. So um, eventually it will damage the image of the Chinese government, and they're afraid that Southeast Asian countries may end up influencing, being influenced already by this kind of transparency efforts of the Philippine government, for them to be exposed in Chinese aggression. And then the second reason is that I think the other reason is because the Chinese government are wanting to lead the narrative that because of the upcoming national election in 2028, we're going to elect our new president in 2028, and he will be the chief architect of our foreign policy. So right now, if you're going to ask any ordinary Filipino national about the influence of the West Philippine Sea or being pro-China candidate, the chances of winning is also being affected by that kind of question. So if we're going to put a stop on transparency effort, in the next 2 years comes election, the West Philippine Sea will no longer be a concern. A pro-China candidate might again be supported by China and then eventually win a presidential seat or senatorial seat. And then the third main reason, I guess, is that try to imagine that the Chinese government declared a natural reserve in Scarborough Shoal a few months back. And what we have been doing is that we are always patrolling that area. Every time that there are significant changes, like they drop a buoy, you can expect that the following day we're going to bring media and tell the world that the Chinese have dropped a buoy in Baho de Masinloc or in Pag-asa Cay, whenever they have landing. So the Chinese government are immediately exposed with the possibility of uh, possibly conducting illegal reclamation or a complete takeover of a maritime feature. The transparency efforts make them stop and think twice whether they're going to execute that operation. So these are the three, for me, these are the three reasons why Chinese government really wanted to stop the transparency once and for all, because these reasons are um, such a headache for them, and also um, prevent them from carrying out and advancing their interests in the West Philippine Sea.
Jay, as we talked about before, the last time we talked was 2 years ago. And since that time, you've been through a remarkable journey. You, not just you yourself personally, but the Philippines in this relationship with China over the West Philippine Sea. And we've seen these unbelievable incidents broadcast to the entire world. We saw the showdown there at Second Thomas Shoal or Ayungin Shoal, where that one sailor lost his thumb in that very dramatic showdown. We saw, of course, all of the other rammings and blockings, and things seemed to move then from Second Thomas Shoal over to Sabina Shoal, and then recently moving up to Scarborough Shoal, where, of course, back in in August, we had this incident in which these two massive Chinese ships, a very large China Coast Guard ship and even a much larger Chinese destroyer, nearly collided with a much smaller Philippine Coast Guard ship, but ended up colliding with each other. So, with all of this going on, what does this tell us about what is the state of play right now in the West Philippine Sea?
Well, to be honest, Ray, you can see the movement of our vessels. The same thing with the deployment of the Chinese Coast Guard. nothing has changed tremendously. But the only difference is that the world is now well aware of the behavior of the Chinese government. Um, the Chinese Coast Guard remains to bully our fishermen. They are also preventing the Filipino fishermen from getting near Bajo de Masinloc. But I think the very big difference with the Chinese Coast Guard deployment, in which you also notice as you monitor the movement of the vessels in the West Philippine Sea, is that it, last year in 2025, we now are seeing China Coast Guard vessels getting closer to the coast of Luzon. Because in the previous years, these China Coast Guard vessels are only focused in Scarborough Shoal or in Calayan Island Group. But nowadays, we can see them getting near Pangasinan, Ilocos, Mindoro, or even Bataan. And despite of that, we are still deploying our vessels. We are preventing them from normalizing such illegal behavior. And most importantly, we are telling this not just to our Southeast Asian neighbors, but to the entire world.
So the Chinese media uh, attacks you, but they also attack Ray because of his work trying to put shed light on their activities, as you do. And so the Chinese apparently decided that the two of you are working together, and that you actually work for Ray. Now, I work with Ray. No one works for Ray in the right mind, first of all. Second of all, they're saying he has all this money. You see how he dresses. He clearly doesn't have enough money. So I guess to form this in a question, how do you respond to these accusations that you are a puppet of Ray Powell and Ray Powell is this evil villain genius manipulator? It's so ludicrous to me. I can't get over it. Yeah, the beard does it. But why are they going after Ray and trying to attach him to you? Do you think?
It's because, you know, for me, my impact is only here in the Philippines. And because of the videos that I publicized, it also reached the international community. But for Ray, he's actually the antithesis to the claim that, the Chinese government are more aggressive in the West Philippine Sea because Commodore Tarriela doesn't stop talking. But when Ray posted something like, the Chinese Coast Guard monster ship is not just in the West Philippine Sea, it also crossed Luconia Shoal in Malaysia or in Paracel in Vietnam. Or Chinese research vessels are also located in Natuna Island in Indonesia. This posting actually countered the narrative that the transparency provokes China. It's because Ray is the one telling the world that, the Philippines is not just the victim of the Chinese bullying, but the Philippines is the only country in Southeast Asia who stand up for his rights. Comparing it with Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, I have the satellite videos and photos showing that, they're also being harassed. China Coast Guard is also encroaching their own waters, but unfortunately, they choose to be quiet about it. And for me, that is the biggest role and contribution of Ray, telling to the Indo-Pacific that we should not see it as an aggression only dedicated for the Philippines, but it is happening in the entire South China Sea.
Well, for all of that flattery, I'll make sure you get an extra bonus in your check this. Um, so you also deal with a large number of people you often refer to as your trolls, right? People who troll you on social media, who put things into the comments of your posts, who oftentimes will call you names and accuse you of all kinds of perfidy. Um, do you believe that these people are largely simply expressing their political viewpoints, or do you think that this is a more coordinated attack?
I think this is a very well coordinated attack. If you're going to look at the way the statements of the Chinese embassy are being released, and then compare notes with the lines of these trolls and social media influencers, it is not coincidental that they have the same praising of words, they have the same messaging. I think this is the message that was distributed to them, and their only role is actually to amplify it.
So the United States just came out with its national defense strategy, and it talks about working in the first island chain to basically deter China. It doesn't define how it's going to do that or what that looks like. It was very clear it wants to work with allies, which clearly must mean the Philippines, in accomplishing this. So if you could talk to Secretary Hegseth or President Trump about what would be most useful for the United States to do, what would that be?
You know, Jim, I've been mentioning this to Ray and some of the American lawmakers who visit here in the Philippines. I, as a Coast Guard, I recognize the naval power of the U.S. Navy, and the entire defense war machine of the U.S. Government. But as a Coast Guard, I also wanted to highlight the fact that the presence of the U.S. Coast Guard white hull vessels here in South China Sea will be a game changer. Try to imagine if you bring the U.S. naval ships here, the U.S. carrier group. The Chinese government always have this very effective misinformation or propaganda line that here comes the U.S. carrier group, and you're the ones who are escalating the tension. Even if you have the goodest and best intentions, that will always be the propaganda. The US Navy vessels are here, and you're the reason why tensions are rising. Because the Chinese government were just going to respond with the illegal presence of the US carrier group. And secondly, if you're going to analyze the deployment of the White House vessels in Southeast Asia, particularly in the entire South China Sea, Vietnam has been building their Vietnam Coast Guard. The same thing with Malaysian Coast Guard, Indonesian Coast Guard, Philippine Coast Guard. And China also learned about using Coast Guard a year after the standoff in 2013. Nobody's going to be criticized that somebody is militarizing the dispute. It's because among us, Southeast Asians, we are deploying our Coast Guard vessels. We are saying that we are not provoking anybody, or we don't want to escalate the tension. We don't want warships there because there is a very high possibility of miscalculation. And for China, their narrative is also pretty much the same like that. That they are there, we take ownership of this area, and what we're doing is not actually escalating tension. We are only here for maritime law enforcement operation. Although we know for a fact that them being there is actually illegal. But for them, they're just doing maritime law enforcement patrol. Now, try to imagine bringing the U.S. Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea, saying that, the U.S. Coast Guard mandate, we also have our obligation for an agreement about combating IUUF, the illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. So, if the U.S. Coast Guard vessels will patrol the South China Sea, you will also serve the mutual interests of other Southeast Asian countries. For Vietnam, fisheries is a concern. Damage the marine environment as well. So you can get the regional support from Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. At the same time, you can freely navigate in that area, not because you are escalating or provoking China, but in the context of constabulary roles, which is beneficial for the entire region about countering smuggling, countering piracy, countering the constabulary roles of the U.S. Coast Guard. It's an easy sell for Southeast Asia. Unlike you bring FONOPS. I mean, for me, I've been supportive of FONOPS, the MCA. But if you conduct any survey in Southeast Asians, they would always say like, the U.S. naval warships is actually the source of tension. You can hear that from Malaysia, for Singapore, for Indonesia. It's like where Ray and I attended last time in California. There's this academic from Singapore claiming that the presence of the U.S. naval warship is also a possibility of escalation. So the U.S. government hasn't made such innovation in changing your maritime security deployment.
So, Jay, the Philippines has, as you've mentioned, had sort of mixed messages coming out of the other ASEAN nations, but it has been getting some moral and even material support from other countries, including a number of Coast Guard vessels, excuse me, now pledged by France, in order to bolster the Philippine Coast Guard's capability in the West Philippine Sea. What difference will these vessels make?
Well, for Japan, we are expecting to receive five more 97-meter vessels. These are the largest Coast Guard vessels that we have, and obviously, these vessels can stay longer because of their capacity. For the French vessel, I think this will be 40-meter, 35-meter patrol boats. But for the Philippine Coast Guard, we have other mandates as well. So it may not be entirely used for the West Philippine Sea Patrol, but just like the U.S. Coast Guard, we also have a role for maritime safety, marine environmental protection, and maritime law enforcement.
So going back to the history, I can't remember what year it was, but a declaration of a code of conduct was declared in the South China Sea regarding how China and the ASEAN nations would treat each other and their vessels in this disputed territory. And it's supposed to be codified into a code of conduct. And these negotiations have been going on, 15 years now? It's been a long time. Now, heard that President Marcos is talking again about trying to finalize this code of conduct. Can you say what are the sticking? Why is it taking so long? Is it possible to come to an agreement on how countries in the South China Sea behave towards each other?
Well, I can speak for the Southeast Asian countries. We had the 2002 DOC, although that is not something that is can be seen as a legally binding. But among us in Southeast Asia, for Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, although we have our own differences when it comes to the South China Sea concern, but we don't allow those differences to be used in abusing our own fishermen or harassing our own coast guard. We learn to coexist peacefully. But the problem with that is the Chinese government is the one who harasses Coast Guard vessels, not just for the Philippines, but for even for other Coast Guard vessels, and even for the other for the Filipino fishermen, and also with their fishermen. They're also occupying some of the maritime features. They did a massive reclamation, as you know. So it has always been the Chinese government who has been not respecting the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. Now, as to the question, what really delays the code of conduct? I would assume that this has always been the Chinese government, because in the first place, they're the ones who have a much more bully behavior in dealing with other Southeast Asian countries.
So, speaking of this, clearly China's approach to Jay Tarriela recently has been to attempt to either intimidate you or to shut you down, right? Either intimidate you into being quiet or to intimidate the Philippine government into getting rid of you or shutting you up. In the same way, there has been an effort to sort of intimidate the Philippines as a lesson to other Southeast Asian or regional countries. Don't act like this, right? Because this is what you'll get. You have
Mhm.
said you won't be intimidated. And President Marcos has just come out and given strong backing to you and to others in the Philippines who are standing up for Philippine sovereign rights. Who is being intimidated, do you think?
Well, are you referring to here in the Philippines?
In general, it can be in the Philippines, it can be regionally, it can be internationally.
Well, I think the Chinese government are really hoping that through intimidation, they can shut down the transparency efforts. And then at the same time, I also believe that this kind of intimidation and threat is not just for the Philippines as an audience, but even for our ASEAN neighbors. Um, this form of intimidation can make our other countries realize that we don't have to follow the transparency efforts. It's because according to the Chinese government, somebody's gonna pay the price if you choose to do exposure of the Chinese aggression.
So in the Philippines, are people, the public and large, aware of what's going on in the South China Sea and aware of the efforts to get you to be quiet? Or is this under the radar?
When we started the transparency effort, Filipinos are only like 70% supportive of the fight in the West Philippine Sea. And then in 2024, there was also a survey asking about the awareness of the Filipino people. It reached to 88%. And the most recent was last December about the question as to do they support the transparency effort in exposing Chinese aggression. And the result was very convincing. 94% of the Filipinos support the transparency efforts in the West Philippine Sea, meaning 9 out of 10 Filipinos really appreciate the position of the national government in telling the Filipino people and the world about the incidents that are happening in the West Philippine Sea.
Jay, you're a really unique figure in a lot of ways. I study a lot of international uh, geopolitical affairs and particularly in Southeast Asia, and to have a one-star flag officer who is so vocal and so out front in sort of advancing his country's position. But one of the results of that has been that you have actually come under fire from some of your own Philippine legislators who would like you to be more quiet, would like you to question your motives sometimes. What is it like to be sort of called in front of, the Senate or the Congress to answer for these things which you're doing presumably at the behest of the Philippine government?
Well, honestly, Roy, people are asking like, aren't am I not afraid every time I face some of those lawmakers who says that the West Philippine Sea is not an issue, it's not real, it's just a figment of our imagination, and I would always respond back, correcting them, whether officially in a congressional hearing or in social media. I mean, and that is actually my point. I mean, you don't really need to become a one-star flag round. You don't really need to become a Coast Guard officer. For me, the Filipino people should understand that standing up for our rights in the West Philippine Sea is actually the obligation of everybody, especially for the fake news of misinformation, or for any lawmakers telling that the West Philippine Sea is not real, that we should, slow down our position. All of us should stand up, because I always highlight the fact that, the Philippines as a sovereign nation, we have a very long history of fighting for our own independence. And for me, West Philippine Sea is part of the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So if you consider yourself as a Filipino, if you consider yourself as part of our country, then regardless wherever you're from, whether you're in Luzon, besides Mindanao, you're public, you are in the military, uniform service, private individual, everybody has to speak up. That's what I want the Filipino people must understand. That it is our obligation, because we owe this to our national heroes. And this is our obligation for the next generation of Filipinos.
Well, what impresses me is your critics don't argue that you are lying about what's going on in the West Philippine Sea. You are saying, here are these ships, here's where they are, they're in our territory that we claim. You should know. And the criticism is you shouldn't be saying that, or they're saying you're making it up.
Well, for the Chinese embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're saying that I'm the one providing the misinformation and smearing campaign against them. That's their narrative. But for the trolls, they were saying that um, what I have been doing in exposing all this Chinese aggression is actually provocation that may escalate the tension. They're not saying that what I'm publicizing are wrong, but they're more worried about the impact that the Chinese might, be more aggressive, and that this kind of speaking tone, whenever I publicize this incidents, would provoke China. So these are their ways of appreciation of what I do.
So Jay, let's get you out of here on this. This is, as we mentioned, this has been almost 3 years now that this has been going on when the Philippines really began its transparency initiative, and you have been at the forefront almost the entire time. First of all, what has this journey been like for you personally? What have the costs been for you? But also, what has gratified you about the journey you've been on for these past 3 years in promoting transparency in the West Philippine Sea?
Every time I'm being asked, like, what are the most significant, you know, that you would say, like, you feel like fulfillment of what you do. Um, when I started this transparency efforts, which according to the trolls, they said that when we started this boss Ray, uh, they were saying that the Filipinos cannot even you know understand what WPS stands for, not across the entire country. If you go in different provinces, people would even ask you, like, what WPS stands for. But nowadays, if you go to Mindanao or in Visayas, once you say WPS, they can immediately relate West Philippine Sea. And I have been visiting universities, high schools in different parts of the country, and I now saw a significant change of the awareness of the youth. When you say WPS, they would eventually know it's West Philippine Sea. The second other sense of fulfillment that I have is, you can check this on Twitter, Ray. The embassies, the diplomatic missions here in the Philippines. When we started the transparency, it has always been the U.S. government who has been mentioning, like, the U.S. embassy is concerned about the Chinese aggression, blah blah blah. It's only the U.S. embassy who has been identifying China as the aggressor and the reason of tension. But if you're going to look at the statement of other embassies, they would always prefer China to become like Voldemort in Harry Potter, a person that cannot be named. So all of these embassies before, whenever they ask me to brief them about the recent incident, I always remind them that during the first few days, I said, whenever I give you this briefing, you always say that the embassy of blank really supports you, Jay. We like what you do. But I told them that but every time I look at your tweet or your social media posts, you cannot even name China. You cannot even name the China Coast Guard. You cannot even mention China Coast Guard harasses Filipino fishermen or RAMs or water cannons, blah, blah, blah. It's very generic. China became Voldemort. But nowadays, every time that the incidents are happening, these embassies are now naming China. They are now confident in mentioning that the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese Maritime Militia, or PLA Navy warship, or Chinese research desk. And for me, that is the most important turning point of transparency. The mere fact that it is not just the Philippines that became aware, but the international community choose to also stand up and hear our own voice.
Well, thank you for lending us your voice today, Jay Tarriela. It's been a pleasure having you back again. It's hopefully we will not wait 2 years until we do this again. And we do thank you for coming on our show today.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thanks, Jim.
And of course, our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. My co-host, Jim Caruso, is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can, of course, visit their website at bauergroupasia.com.
So, Ray, it turns out that the Chinese embassy and the Chinese government is after Jay, but they've decided to come after you again for something a little different. You want to talk about that?
I can't understand why I'm so harmless. So actually, so this is we kind of brought up with Jay. As many times as sort of I've been in the spotlight from various places, whether it be Chinese state media or sort of certain acolytes and in the Philippine ecosystem or whatever. This is the first time I've really sort of had been directly targeted by the Chinese embassy. And it was incidental to a report that we put out, or that I actually wrote a few days ago, about the influence of the Chinese embassy directly with Mandarin language media outlets in the Philippines, which appear, the more that we stare at them, to have been almost entirely sort of taken over in a lot of ways by the Chinese, sort of state propaganda system. And, we gave some examples of how this works and the kinds of things that these outlets are now saying that are directly, sort of relate back to Chinese state interest, advocating for the absorption of Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, or advocating for China's position on the West Philippine Sea, those kinds of things, or even just, rebroadcasting Chinese state media without, no questions asked, no context provided, no critical thought applied. And then, we even sort of talked about how one of these media outlets, United News, actually is led, its chief editor is also the Secretary General of the Philippine Council for the Promotion of the Peaceful Reunification of China, which is a very long way of saying a united front operation in the Philippines that is trying to promote the absorption of Taiwan into China. And so, kind of putting all of this together and saying, look, something is going on here in Chinese language media in the Philippines that is targeting Filipino citizens. And that earned me several broadsides, I will say, from the Chinese embassy.
Well, transparency is your mantra, and apparently all that light is being disturbing, causing maybe a little melanoma. Um, but we saw some of this Chinese influence on Chinese language media when we were in Australia,
Yep.
and Australia subsequently passed some legislation, which we've been talking about,
Yep.
to require more transparency.
Yeah. And in fact, you and I wrote an article about that for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute about last month, talking about how the Philippines can actually learn from Australia's experience, which has not been perfect by any means. And we're not saying that Australia is the big brother should teach the little brother. This is more, Australia has been down this road and has learned some lessons, both positive and negative. It's a great opportunity to sort of pass those on to another democracy that's finding itself sort of in the midst of all this of some very similar issues.
I think it behooves all democracies to work more closely together, share information about how to defend ourselves against these sort of influences.
Yeah, and really, I think it's one of those things. Chinese language media. I think the more that I look at this problem, it's clear that China has really made a concerted effort to bring all of this sort of to heel. And so the number of Chinese language media which are actually truly independent seems to be diminishing every year. And so I think probably all democracies need to take a look and say, what is going on with our Chinese language media? And one of the reasons that they don't, in many cases, is because nobody, so few people understand Mandarin anyway, that it's hard to know what they're saying. And I don't speak Mandarin, so I rely, like so many other people, on things like Google Translate and AI to tell me what's going on in Chinese language media, and I've been shocked.
Well, the other issue, of course, is so-called, freedom of the press, and they should be able to publish what they want, which I agree with, but just be transparent about who you're getting the information from.
Yes, the information and, if any, guidance and direction, and certainly funding, right? So all of that should be open to the public, for the public to see. And again, as you say, if people want to run advertisements saying that China should own the entire South China Sea and the Philippines should, restrict its activities to its internal waters, under the Philippine Constitution, that's legal. People can have political opinions, but we should just know where the money comes from. We should know if there are direct contacts or direct, directions coming from the Chinese Communist Party to these entities that are in your own country. Those are the kinds of things I think every country needs to think about. How do I balance freedom of expression, freedom of speech, all the freedoms we enjoy in democracies with the need to protect ourselves against exploitation by a hostile foreign power?
This is why it's such a lovely irony that the Chinese accuse you of being a agent of the U.S. government with huge pots of money, which you don't share with me, by the way.
And by the
Um,
way, I will have you know that I did not buy either this shirt or this sweater at the thrift store, so I can't afford to buy my own clothes.
so it's a matter of taste, not affordability. I understand now.
Right. Well, one person who has great taste is our producer Ian Ellis Jones, and we really appreciate him and IEJ Media for helping us put together this podcast and get it out to everyone out there in our audience. And we also want to recognize the outstanding value of his military and geopolitical graphics that get so much attention on X. Please follow him at Ian Ellis Jones. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe and follow. You can also follow us on YouTube at youtube.com/@IPPodcast. And of course, on social media, we are on X, we are on LinkedIn, and we are on Facebook. And you can email us if you really have something that you want to make sure we see. That's where you get us at Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. That's Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. And of course, we do want to thank our sponsors, Bauer Group Asia. You can visit them at BauerGroupAsia.com. So for Ian and Jim, I am Ray, and we want to thank Jay for joining us today. And Jay, just make sure you check that super secret account that we've set up that only you and I know about and nobody else will ever find out about, where I deposit all of that money that I'm supposed to be giving you. Good day, and join us again next time. Thanks, and good night.